She was gone, the car destroyed. And yet, the bear cub wouldn't stop crying at her door. The morning mist had barely lifted from the mountain road when the first responders arrived. Twisted metal, shattered glass, and the eerie silence that follows impact. The car had veered off a blind curve and plummeted into a shallow ditch, its frame crumpled like paper. Smoke still rose from the hood, curling upward into the pine-laced air. They expected wreckage. They expected silence. They did not expect the cub. At first, they thought it was a trick of the fog, a shape huddled low beside the passenger side door, unmoving. But then it cried, a small, sharp, heart-splitting sound. Not a growl, not a whimper, a sob. The firefighters hesitated. It was unmistakably a bear cub, no more than a few months old. Dirty, scorched fur, no visible wounds but trembling. And it wasn't trying to get away. It was pressed up against the mangled door, tiny paws scratching, head nudging. "Is there someone still inside?" one of them asked. But the medics had already checked. The driver, a woman, mid-30s, had been thrown from the car. No pulse, no ID, just a ring around her neck on a faded leather cord, and a story no one could yet explain. The cub kept crying. They tried to coax it away, gently at first, then with food. It didn't move. One volunteer stepped forward, a young woman named Riley who worked with the local wildlife shelter. She knelt slowly, her voice low. "Hey, little one. It's okay. She's not here anymore." The cub turned to her, just once, eyes full of something not wild, not tame, grief. Then it looked back at the door and cried again. No one knew where it had come from or why it had chosen that door, but something had brought it there, and it wasn't coincidence. Not this time. Riley took the cub home that night. There wasn't much else to do. Animal control had no protocols for grieving bears, and the local shelter wasn't equipped for wildlife of this kind. Besides, the cub refused to leave her side. When she tried to walk ahead, it followed. When she stopped, it sat beside her. When she cried, silently in the quiet of her truck, the cub pressed its head to her shoulder and didn't move. She named him Bruno. The days that followed were slow. Bruno wouldn't eat unless Riley was in the room. He wouldn't sleep unless her door was open. And sometimes, at night, he would pad down the hallway and sit beside her bed, looking not at her, but at the window, as if waiting for someone else. Riley started searching, through old news articles, missing pet registries, wildlife reports. She found nothing about a bear cub fitting Bruno's description, but she did find something else. 3 months earlier, a woman named Elise had been reported missing after posting a viral video. In it, she stood on her cabin's porch, feeding a small bear cub from a bottle. "They told me he wouldn't make it," she said into the camera. "But he's stronger than anyone thinks. We both are." Same dark patch above the right eye, same scar on the foreleg, same eyes. Riley watched the video on loop for hours. The woman, Elise, had lived less than 60 miles from the crash site. That couldn't be a coincidence. Bruno had remembered. Somehow, when the crash happened, he had followed her, tracked her scent, stayed, until help arrived, until someone else could carry what he could not. After that, everything changed. Riley didn't try to train him, didn't try to cage him. She let Bruno move through her house like wind through branches, quiet, constant, belonging to nothing but never unwelcome. He grew, in size, in strength, but never in distance. Even as months passed and the world forgot the crash, Bruno did not. Every evening he would sit by Riley's front door, just for a while, then disappear into the woods. And every morning, without fail, he would return, always with something in his mouth, a stone, a pine cone, once a piece of torn cloth faded by sun. He'd drop it by the door. Look at Riley and wait, not for thanks, not for praise, but because something inside him had learned that memory needs a place to rest, and he had chosen her door. She began keeping the objects, not out of sentimentality at first, but because each one felt like a piece of a language they were building together. A pine cone with a bite mark, a ribbon tangled in fur, a twig that had snapped like the frame of that car. She lined them up on the windowsill, calling it Bruno's shelf. Visitors thought it was quaint. Riley knew better. It was a ledger of grief, a map of healing. Then one morning she opened the door to find not an object, but Bruno himself, curled in a tight ball, his head resting on a worn leather cord. The necklace from the crash, Elise's. Riley had never seen it again after that day, and no one had claimed it from the coroner. Bruno had found it. Somehow, in all his silent roaming, he had tracked down what no one else had bothered to recover. A loop of memory, a final circle closed. She knelt beside him and whispered, "She would be proud of you." Bruno didn't lift his head, but his breathing slowed and something in the air settled, like snow after a storm, like silence after a scream, like a promise kept long after the one who made it was gone. Riley sat beside him for hours. She didn't touch him, didn't speak again. She just stayed, because staying was what Bruno had always done. And now, it was her turn. The light shifted as the day moved on. Birds returned to the trees. A breeze picked up and carried with it the scent of pine and memory. Bruno slept soundly, the necklace still beneath his paw like a final offering. Not of grief, but of remembrance. In the weeks that followed, Bruno's visits became less frequent. Riley knew better than to try and hold on. Love like his wasn't meant to be leashed. It was meant to find its way back when it mattered most. But sometimes on quiet evenings, she'd still hear soft footsteps outside. Sometimes she'd find a new object placed by the door, a feather, a button. Once, a smooth stone shaped like a heart. And sometimes she'd wake in the middle of the night with the sense that someone was sitting outside again, not needing her help, but simply choosing to be near. The shelf by the window kept growing, so did the quiet in her chest, but this time, it wasn't hollow, it was whole. Because some stories don't end, they echo through fur and feathers, through pine cones and pine trees, through love that doesn't speak, but is always heard. And in that silence, Riley found something she didn't know she had lost, a rhythm that existed outside of words. Each time she touched one of the objects Bruno had left, she felt the shape of a memory, not her own, but somehow deeply familiar, as if the grief had found a way to communicate in the language of touch, presence, and return. She began walking the edge of the forest in the early mornings, not to find him, but to feel close to the path he once took. Sometimes she left something of her own at the tree line, a glove, a scarf, a note weighted down by stone. She didn't know if Bruno ever found them, but the act of giving back felt right. Seasons changed, the shelf filled, her heart did too. And even though she never saw Bruno again up close, his memory never left. Because love like his doesn't fade, it circles, it waits, it remembers. And somewhere out there, in the hush between trees, a promise still walks on four paws, quiet, strong, and eternal. Riley often found herself listening for him in the wind, on days when the world felt too loud, too fast, too forgetful. She'd close her eyes and picture Bruno weaving through the underbrush, brushing past ferns with the same grace he once moved through her hallway. She started keeping a journal, not of her thoughts, but of the items he had left. Each one cataloged with a date, a weather note, and a guess, a soft narrative she assigned to each offering. She began calling them his stories. In a way, they were. One day, years later, a young girl from the nearby town knocked on her door. She had a leaf in her hand, perfectly preserved, curled at the tip like a question mark. "He left this on our porch," the girl said. Riley didn't need to ask who he was. She smiled, took the leaf, and placed it on the shelf beside the others. "You can keep it if you like," the girl offered. Riley shook her head. "He knows where it belongs." Because some hearts don't disappear, they disperse into stories, into seasons, into the quiet steps we take toward what we once loved. And when the sun rose low through the trees and the wind danced just right, Riley could still feel the rhythm of pause and the weight of memory brushing gently past her door. She never called it goodbye. She called it return. And in that return, something in her life reassembled itself. The ache that had once felt sharp began to feel sacred. Not absence, but presence. shaped differently. She began speaking to the woods each morning, not in words but in intention. A silent thank you, a quiet welcome, a nod to something still out there, listening. Children from the town began visiting, not because she invited them, but because the story had spread, about the bear who grieved, the woman who stayed, and the shelf full of whispers. They left their own tokens sometimes, painted rocks, folded paper hearts, pieces of string tied with names. Riley kept them all, because every gift, no matter how small, was part of the same legacy. Not hers, not Bruno's, theirs. A quiet archive of love that outlived explanation, a map of connection drawn not in roads, but in returns. And when the last light of day stretched long across her porch, she would sit alone, smile softly and say, "He's still out there." Not in doubt, but in knowing, and that knowing was enough. It filled the spaces where silence used to echo. It warmed the porch steps, creaked the old wood with familiarity, and danced in the dust that lingered in beams of light. Riley no longer looked out into the forest expecting a shape to appear. Instead, she greeted each morning as if he already had. Quietly, respectfully, faithfully. People would still come, some seeking healing, others curiosity. Some brought questions, others offerings. A story had formed around her now, not as the woman who once kept a bear, but as the one who never stopped listening. And in every story shared, Bruno lived again. In their drawings, in their poems, in the way children paused by the door just to touch the shelf, eyes wide, as if they could feel his presence pressed into every object. And maybe they could, because love that loyal doesn't vanish. It seeds, it roots, and it grows wherever it's welcomed, like in the heart of a girl with a leaf, or a woman who waited, or a bear who remembered. And when the time was right, when the sun fell just so and the trees whispered low, Riley would whisper back, "You're home." And somehow, always, the forest answered. And when it did, it spoke in ways only the heart could translate. In the rustle of leaves, there was recognition. In the hush of snow settling on moss, there was memory. Sometimes Riley would pause mid-task, sensing something just beyond perception, a warmth, a breath, a glance without eyes. She wouldn't chase it, wouldn't speak, just smile and carry on. Because presence, she had learned, wasn't always meant to interrupt. Sometimes it was meant to accompany. On her quietest days, she would visit the crash site, not to mourn, but to tend. A few wildflowers had taken root there over the years. She never planted them, but they always bloomed. Yellow, resilient, familiar. She never fenced the spot. She never marked it. She just left it open. A place where memory could roam freely. A place where Bruno could return, if ever he wished. And every time the wind shifted just right, she'd hear it again. Not a sound, but a presence. Still walking, still watching, still remembering. Because some bonds outlast words, and some doors are never truly closed. They stay slightly ajar, not to the wind, but to the memory of footsteps that once crossed their threshold. In time, that door on Riley's porch became something of a symbol. People who visited never knocked. They simply stood before it, quietly, as if waiting to be invited not into a home, but into a feeling. Riley never added a new coat of paint. She liked how the wood showed its age. The small scratches at the base where Bruno once pushed it open. The sun-bleached spot where he used to rest his head. She'd run her hand over those marks sometimes, not out of sorrow, but reverence. They were part of the house now, part of her and part of him. The town eventually placed a small sign on the trailhead leading to her land. It didn't say memorial. It didn't need to. It just said, the path of the bear. Children whispered stories about the guardian of the forest. Artists painted his silhouette into local murals. And Riley, with her ever-growing shelf of tokens and tales, never corrected a single one of them. Because in every version of the story, truth remained. He had chosen her, and she, in return, had kept the door open. Always. And somewhere in the hush of that forest, beneath stars that blinked like old memories and wind that still knew his name, a trail pressed into moss by padded feet remained. Maybe unseen, maybe overgrown, but never forgotten. Because Bruno was more than a visitor. He was the reminder that love, when freely given, always finds a way back, even if it walks quietly, even if it leaves feathers instead of footprints. And as Riley sat one last time on her porch, the air thick with summer's ending and dusk's golden hush, she whispered, not to the woods, but to the silence beyond them, wherever you are, thank you. And the wind ever so gently carried it home. That night, as the stars settled deep into the sky, Riley lit a single candle on the porch. Not out of habit, not out of hope, but out of gratitude. For every soft paw print, every token left at her door, every quiet morning where memory felt like breath. The flame flickered, and in its light, the worn wooden floor seemed to shimmer with the echoes of years past. She could almost hear him again, that gentle rhythm, the way he used to circle twice before settling at the door. The exhale that meant he felt safe. Somewhere deeper in the woods, an owl called out. And in that call, Riley imagined a reply. A low huff, familiar, faithful. She closed her eyes and smiled. Not because she missed him, but because he had stayed, in spirit, in story, in every quiet corner where love still lingered, waiting to be recognized. Bruno had never needed to be seen to be real. He had simply needed to be remembered. And in that remembrance, Riley found her own shape softening. Her days flowed differently now, not structured by time, but by sensation. The warmth of morning light through the kitchen window, the soft creak of the porch boards as she stepped out with her tea, the way wind pressed gently against the screen door, like a familiar hand. She had once thought grief was something sharp, something to be carried or shed. But Bruno had taught her otherwise. He'd shown her that love could live on without asking for anything more than a place to return to. And so she gave it. Every day the door remained open a little while longer. Just in case, not because she expected pause on the steps, but because some silences deserved to be honored. And if one evening the woods gave him back, just for a moment, she would be ready, with light, with breath, with welcome. And as the years stretched gently onward, Bruno's memory only deepened, not as a shadow behind her, but as a quiet rhythm beneath everything. Riley grew older, but never alone. The forest, once just a backdrop, had become part of her heartbeat. The wind told stories, the moss remembered weight, and the shelf by the window became an altar, not to loss, but to devotion. Each season brought new echoes. In spring, saplings bent just so, as if leaned on. In summer, butterflies hovered longer by the door. In autumn, a trail of small stones would appear overnight, laid carefully in a curve, as if marking the way back. She never spoke of them, never swept them away, just smiled, because somewhere she knew. Bruno still walked, maybe not in body, but in every moment shaped by gentleness, in every silence honored, in every act of patient, unconditional love. He had once been a cub by a wreckage. He had become a legend by a door. And legends, Riley had learned, don't end. They simply wait for the right hearts to carry them forward. And when her hands grew slower and her steps less sure, she began to write, not for herself, but for those who would come after. She told Bruno's story as she remembered it, in full and in fragments, with the names of places only the two of them knew, and with pauses where the silence mattered more than the words. She left the manuscript in a small wooden box beside the door, tied with twine, marked only by a carved paw print on its lid, and she wrote one line on the final page. Love returns, sometimes in fur, sometimes in memory, but always, somehow, in time. Years later, a new family moved into the old house. The walls had been repainted, the porch steps repaired, but the forest around it remained unchanged. Their young son, no more than 7, found the box one morning while exploring the edge of the woods. He brought it inside with reverence, like he'd uncovered treasure. His parents, curious but respectful, read the manuscript aloud by firelight. The boy listened with wide eyes, and when they reached the last line, he looked toward the door. The next morning, a smooth gray stone rested on the porch. Not there the night before. No footprints in the dirt, no explanation, just a beginning. And in that house, once again, someone left the door open, just in case. Because stories like Bruno's don't belong to one person. They pass on, they endure, and sometimes if the heart is quiet enough, it hears a paw step in the dark and smiles before it turns to look. So the story continued, without ending, without edges, just echoes in the trees and warmth in the wood. Not every visitor knew the tale, but those who stayed long enough always felt it, not in words, but in the way the door never creaked when opened, as if it too had learned to welcome something. That never really left. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.